Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Tax Talk, broadcast by the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. My name is Jordan Bateman, and I'm the British Columbia Director of the CTF. And I'm joined, as always, by our Alberta Director, Paige MacPherson. Paige, how are you?
Doing well, thanks. Yeah, lots of news out this way, so I'm looking forward to hearing what's up in Saskatchewan and then talking about how it relates to this province. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Yeah, it's going to be a good show today because we are going to talk about the recent Saskatchewan and Manitoba elections. So it's a classic Western Canadian episode here. We're joined by our Prairie Director, Todd MacKay, who has witnessed both these battles in which free enterprise, less regulation, lower taxes have triumphed in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. And Todd, I understand you're recently back from a dance on Greg Selinger's political grave. Is that accurate?
Well, you know, it was a huge win for the Conservatives in Manitoba, but more than that, I mean, it was a huge win for taxpayers. They were told in the 2011 campaign by all parties that taxes weren't going to go up, and then in 2013, the government raised the PST without following its own legislation that it should have a referendum, and they got pounded for it. So note to everybody else across the country, if you promise not to raise taxes and then you are tempted to raise taxes, resist that temptation or you will get pounded at the polls. That's what happened in Manitoba.
Yeah, especially in Alberta, where maybe they're thinking or dangling a little trial balloon about a sales tax. I think maybe there's a lesson there.
It's amazing to me that Rachel Notley would even consider that, given that half of her staff abandoned Premier Selinger in Manitoba, took massive severance payouts, and then went to work for Premier Notley. Surely to goodness they remember the beating they took in Manitoba and could warn her that, no, ma'am, this is a very, very bad idea. But apparently one beating isn't enough to learn from their mistakes.
Yeah, and then the other half of her staff comes from British Columbia, where they saw a premier have to resign over breaking his promise on HST. So... Mm-hmm. Yes. Take the memory pill, people. Remember. Lots of ways for everyone to connect with us. If you've joined us here live, make sure to subscribe to our feed to keep track of all our shows. You can comment in the sidebar. You can tweet us at Jordan Bateman or at Paige MacPherson. Todd's rocking the @CutThePST handle today, so you can tweet him there. You can also type /Q in the chat and get added to our question queue. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy organization dedicated to three things: lower taxes, less waste, and more government accountability. That's what drives all the communications, research, and advocacy work we do. It's why the three of us get out of bed in the morning and go to work every day with big smiles on our faces and another government to tackle who's wasting our money. You can visit our website at taxpayer.com, see what the three of us are up to, and the whole CTF team, including, let me put a plug in for CVG, Christine Van Geyn, who had a great FOI on the on electric luxury car subsidies from government, because, you know, when you're buying a car priced at about 1.3 million Canadian, you got to have your government subsidy of several $1,000s to pay for it. If you're listening to this later as a podcast or recording, we want to hear from you. You can email me, bc.director@taxpayer.com, or engage on our Facebook page at facebook.com/taxpayer.com. All right, enough of that. Todd, what's new with you?
Well, actually, a little bit of disappointing news out of Saskatchewan. It turns out that the government here indulged in some corporate welfare. So I suspect everybody's heard of the business Skip the Dishes. They deliver restaurant food to your house, so you don't have to do the dishes. Great deal as far as I'm concerned. Sounds like a good idea. But the government here gave them $3 million to expand in Saskatchewan to pay for training for about 300 employees. Why? Like, how hard is this? Like, frankly, doing the dishes isn't that hard. Presumably skipping them isn't rocket science. Look, I'm sure it's helpful to them to have $10,000 per person to do some training. But I suspect, the Jiffy Lube across the street here would have appreciated that. And probably the cafe across the street over here would have appreciated that as well. Maybe we should just lower taxes instead of, taking scoops of tax dollars and giving them to various corporate entities. The Premier says that now they don't have the money to indulge in that kind of thing in the future. In the future, we borrowed $1 billion this year. We didn't have the money for it now. So we got to cut back on this kind of thing. It was disappointing to see it here.
That's so weird, because it seems to me like it's one of those industries where it would be growing sort of naturally. It's one of those sort of online services. Ordering food online is sort of the new thing, right? Instead of calling in, it seems like something that just organically would grow as sort of more and more people discover it and use it. I can't even understand the argument for why this would need a subsidy. I remember when I used to live in Nova Scotia, they'd always make the arguments because there'd be like some struggling ice cream factory sort of in the middle of, not near any urban center. And they say, well, they really can't make it on their own. I don't think that's a good argument for corporate welfare, but that's not a business that's growing. This seems like a business that would be organically growing on its own. Like, what is the argument here?
Right. It's baffling because you're right. The idea of people ordering things on the interweb, that's not going away. No. That part's good pretty well everywhere in the world. If anything, I suspect the biggest threat to a business like this would be competition, that some other company is going to figure out how to do it better and cheaper and faster, in which case, let's not bet on the wrong horse. Let's not bet on any horse. Let's let the best horse win and give the best service to customers. But don't put tax dollars into it. That's just not a good idea. And interestingly, even NDP folks were pounding the government for it here. Need to cut back on that kind of silliness.
So strange.
We got to have a delivery off between Domino's and these guys and see if the $10,000 a head actually created a better service there.
Yeah, see what you get for $10,000 in training somebody to deliver some Chinese food or whatever.
That food better be there before I order it. Let me tell you.
That's right.
That's right. Another service. I think it's called, isn't Just Eat? Wouldn't that be a competing food delivery service?
Look, people delivering food. I mean, that's been going on for a while. Yeah, this has not just been invented. It's not like we're the first ones to think I'd rather not get off my couch to get food, right? So yeah, to say that this is spurring some kind of innovation or whatever, it's totally nonsense. It's just a bad decision is what this is. And it's unfortunate to see it happen here.
So what do you think? Is it a political thing where supporter or just one of these kind of quote unquote cool hip businesses that?
Yeah, what it is, I think, is that governments love to say that they've created jobs.
Yeah.
No, it's not usually true. The government doesn't really create much of anything. It distributes things. And when you look at the justice system or something like that, building roads, it makes some sense. But it's a great press release for them to say Skip the Dishes is adding 300 jobs to Saskatchewan. Great press release. Yeah. But we paid $10,000 a crack for those jobs. What? That's nuts. I mean, how many jobs could have been created on Saskatchewan farms if their taxes had gone down $10,000 a crack? Let's think this through another step.
Yeah, for sure. Paige, what do you got going? It's like a cavalcade of news from Alberta these days.
It is. Honestly, I was looking through my Twitter feed this morning, trying to think what should I say is my what's new, and there's just so many stories. There are so many things in Alberta. I mean, since the last time we talked, we got our credit downgraded twice, I think. That was, that's fun. So we've now got sort of the trifecta, just as we are the trifecta here of the Western provinces on this awesome podcast. We had the trifecta of the major bond rating agencies now say to Alberta that you've been downgraded in terms of your credit rating. So that's one piece of news. There's been a whole bunch, but the one I want to talk about today is about the carbon tax. This is really recent news in Alberta. It's sort of come out in the media that costs are going to go up for municipalities and for school boards because of the carbon tax. So Mayor Nenshi in Calgary sort of raised this issue and said that it's unfair that, city vehicles are going to have to face higher costs because of the carbon tax, and then he doesn't know who's going to pay for this. And then it came out in the Calgary Herald or the Edmonton Journal, one or the other, that costs for school boards are going to go up because of because of these school buses, transportation costs are going to go up, and nobody knows who's going to pay it. And so all of these stories sort of end with nobody knows who's going to cover this cost. But of course we know who's going to cover this cost. It's not going to be school boards absorbing any costs. They're not going to cut their own costs. It's definitely not going to be the city of Calgary. We don't see them cutting their costs. So obviously that's going to fall onto taxpayers. So not only are your individual individual expenses going to go up? Your own gas, your own home heating bill, your own groceries that you have to buy. But now you're going to probably have to bear the burden of downloaded costs from municipalities and school boards. And so this is interesting. I was wondering, Jordan, if anything like this sort of came up in BC when they were talking about the carbon tax.
Yeah, it's come up in two different ways. The carbon tax did add costs. And you got to remember, municipalities are huge purchasers of fuel. So all their fleets, moving people around, like they buy a lot of fuel. Transit, of course, buys a lot of fuel. So all of that was a big jump. School boards as well, with school buses, heating their buildings, also purchase a lot of fuel. So that was a big problem. And then it was compounded by a rule that the BC Liberals have where even schools, universities, and hospitals have to be carbon neutral. So they actually have to buy carbon offsets for the greenhouse gases they emit. Now, the three of us would sit here and go, on what planet would we consider schools, universities, and hospitals to be polluters that need to do this? But they had to do that. They fixed that a little bit in that now that money goes right back into the school districts as far as buying new boilers and things like that. But no, the carbon tax was a major cost driver for these agencies. And one of the reasons why actually the carbon tax has been frozen for the past 5 years and is likely to be frozen for the next 3 to 5 years is simply because, it's just one more knock on these lower level agencies that they just can't afford. So, or they'll pass it on to us in tax increases. So yeah, we did a lot around kind of the double hit of the carbon tax where you had to pay your own carbon tax increase, but you also had to pay your share of your cities and your school boards and your hospitals carbon tax increase.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, it's sort of been discussed, and this, these conversations always sort of bear out on Twitter. And then the select few of us who are actually following them, follow them, and the rest of people go on about their normal daily lives. But those of us who are following Twitter, this conversation has sort of borne out. And one of the comments is, well, yeah, it makes sense. I mean, anybody who is an emitter or any organization that's an emitter should pay the cost. That's how the carbon tax should work. And that's, the theory. So yeah, of course, school boards costs should go up. And of course, the city's costs should go up. And, in some sort of perfect world where maybe economists are creating the policy and we have some sort of an economist-driven philosopher king society, then those organizations would have to cut their costs or try to emit less. But when you think about it, I mean, city vehicles, they're probably important. School boards, school buses and stuff, I mean, they're probably important things that are in place for a reason and probably moving around for purposes. And they're not going to cut their costs. So, I mean, at the end of the day, you've got sort of this idyllic idea that, these organizations, everybody's an equal emitter. They're going to have to share their costs. But at the end of the day, it all falls onto taxpayers. And so that's probably what we're going to be dealing with here.
I got it. We're online, so we got to weigh in on the Nenshi Ubers are jerks and that Periscope thing. Now I know Nenshi as a brand is, plain talking, social media savvy guy, but this to me seems a little too Trump-esque to play well in Calgary. So I know it's gone to some sort of ethics commissioner or something like that. But what do you think the political fallout is? We've always heard Nenshi is bulletproof, but my suspicion is the brand is starting to or the shine's starting to come off him a bit.
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, I think it depends what comes out of this ethics investigation, and I think it depends whether the ethics investigation looks into what is important here. Because, in some ways, this story has been covered as Nenshi saying, so he was in a Lyft ride, which is a service similar to Uber, in Boston, and he was talking to the driver and said to the driver, he called the Uber CEO a dick. I'm just going to say it. So, and I mean, I don't really think that's a big deal. Like, I don't know if Calgarians think that's a big deal, but that made a lot of the headlines, like that, as if that was the story. But the real story is that it was suggested in this conversation that the city might have sent criminals, registered sex offenders, to try and apply to be an Uber driver and basically see if they would pass Uber's background test. And then Nenshi said, sort of gloating, that they did pass the background check. So no, the city's going to do the background check. The police are going to do the background check. Like basically trying to sort of put Uber in a corner there. And that's the real story, right? I mean, that's the story. How did the city find criminals and registered sex offenders? Did they engage them? Were they paid? I mean, did tax dollars go into this at all? These are the important questions. And so this has been somewhat covered, but it's been a little bit overshadowed by Nenshi saying a swear word, which I don't think anybody actually cares about. So I think that the investigation really needs to dig into the real story here, which is, I think, the real ethics concern is, why is the city engaging with criminals at all? And are tax dollars being used for this, especially in the context of the mayor, asking for new tax powers, saying that they don't have enough money, that they have a revenue problem. These are important things. So I think whatever comes out of the investigation will determine how big of a fallout there is from this, and just ensure that, the focus is in the right area.
Todd, let's role play the human resources conversation between City Calgary and the sex offender.
Yeah, oh my goodness. I can't even imagine. It's hard to imagine that actually happened. I can see them sitting around on a Friday afternoon on the patio. They cut out of work early and had a few pints and then thought this was a great idea. But surely to goodness, somebody in City Hall would have been like, "Wait, what? No, we don't know." One of the things that I thought of when I saw this story, though, is that is the mayor really focused on providing safe, good service for Calgarians, or does he just not like Uber, or does he just not like running afoul of the taxi lobby and that kind of stuff? If you even hear him talking about these kind of tactics, it doesn't really sound like he's focused on the safety of people in Calgary. It sounds like he's on a little bit of a vendetta, right? That to me, that was really concerning. What's the motivation here? Because, hey, I'm all for making sure it's safe. Do what it takes, make it safe. But to just do ridiculous things to try to make people look bad, wow, it's not good. And then, of course, there's always the lesson of, especially if you're in politics, be careful with what you say to anybody, because it's always going to end up on the front page one way or the other.
It's interesting with these kinds of politicians, like you make the Trump comment, Jordan, like these politicians who they're sort of beloved because they're not typical politicians, because they kind of just say what they think. And Nenshi is, on maybe the other side of the spectrum from like a Trump or a Rob Ford or whatever, but he is sort of liked for that same reason. He's not sort of a typical politician, and he sort of is off the cuff. But then you get into situations like this, right? So, where you're kind of like gloating a little bit, or you're kind of maybe bragging, like better, and you kind of just some random driver in Boston that you feel that you need to sort of just share everything with, kind of to gloat, like that you get yourself into these kinds of situations. and that's often, that does not help these sorts of politicians.
Does make me wonder what other kind of videos these guys have.
Yeah.
Surely the mayor wasn't the only one to say something stupid in a car like that. I'm just saying, there could be some pretty entertaining TV there.
Yeah, taxi cab confessions.
Indeed.
Yes. Well, Mayor Nenshi, there you go. We've had our run-ins with Mayor Nenshi in the past, so I'm not shedding any tears for him being called up on this stuff. But the other thing I thought about in that situation was, there are other things that cities get criminal record checks for. For example, if you want to rent, if you're in kids minor sports and you want the subsidy to get ice, every coach, every manager has to have a criminal record check. Is Nenshi putting sex offenders through that process to see if they're being caught out? That's there's lots of places where cities are involved in regulation. Does he just have a couple sex offenders on standby where you can roll them through a process? Like it's crazy. I've never heard anything like that.
I know.
Municipally here in British Columbia. And I talked to a couple of city managers who were aghast at the suggestion and just couldn't even comprehend the conversation that would have to happen in order for that to be created. And then couldn't even figure out, like, where would we even go to recruit that, right? Like, do you call the cops and ask for a list? Like, just, it was crazy.
The whole legal department, no doubt, canceled all their vacation.
Yeah, that's right. They
just
worked
like, oh,
double time.
We're done.
Yeah.
Brutal.
Yes. There's probably some FOIPs there that could be fun.
Oh, man.
The other thing
Anyways.
is I believe the ethics commissioner is new. So I think this is like their first task. Like, imagine starting a new job. I kind of felt like kind of crazy when I started this new job because the NDP was elected. It was this huge political overturn in Alberta. I'm like, what a weird time to start a job. That definitely trumps this. Like the ethics commissioner job trumps what I went through for sure. Because
I would say
got a lot on your plate right away.
Yeah, welcome to Calgary.
Yeah.
Welcome to Calgary. Out here in BC, the big issue this week has been a revelation of how much the Premier of British Columbia gets topped up on her pay. So she gets about $190,000 a year from taxpayers for being the Premier. And the BC Liberal government, it was revealed, has been paying about $50,000 a year on top of that. They call it a stipend or a leader's allowance. She's disclosed every single year in her disclosures that she was paid some type of stipend, but the disclosure papers don't require a dollar amount, and no reporter thought to ask her. So imagine our surprise when we flip open or get the Globe and Mail, and the top banner story in the national edition of Canada's national newspaper is the fact that she gets about $50,000 a year in a stipend. This has caused quite a bit of consternation among the chattering class. It's dominated question periods. And I don't know, my whole response to this is a big meh. Like, what do I care if the party pays her a little bit more money? I mean, yeah, the party gets tax receipts, pretty favorable tax receipts for donations. But to me, this is a Liberal Party issue. And if the Liberal Party donors don't like it, they should hold back their money and send it to the Taxpayers Federation instead. Am I wrong on this, or is it just like?
No, I thought the same thing. Like, I mean, what I thought. Well, first of all, I did think like, wow, it doesn't sit super well with me, but not as a taxpayer. More so if I was a supporter of the BC Liberals. I don't know if that would be a surprise to them because I don't know. I don't talk to BC Liberals members on a regular basis, so I don't know. Maybe they knew. Maybe this was something that was sort of known in the party. I suspect probably not. Maybe amongst the sort of grassroots members of the party, they might not have known this kind of thing. So this might have come as a surprise. But to taxpayers, I mean. No, I don't think it's an issue. It probably just has more political implications in terms of how Christy Clark looks than, taxpayer implications in terms of any cost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, I'd have to look it up to get the exact numbers, but I'm pretty sure that Premier Wall has the same deal in Saskatchewan here, and gets money from the Saskatchewan party. Yeah, I think for party members, they've got to ask whether that makes sense for their donations of, $100, $200 at a time to go to the Premier. I will say, I mean, these people do a lot of work for the party. I mean, they do a lot of work for the government, but they do a lot of work for the party too. So I think there's an argument there. The part that makes me just a little bit uncomfortable is, in Saskatchewan particularly, there's no limits on donations in terms of size or who can give donations. Businesses and unions and so on can give donations as well. So when the money goes to the political party and then goes to the politician, there's at least a chance of a perception of wrongdoing there. I don't think that's often the case, or really ever. I've never seen anything that would make me think so, but I think it raises that question. But at the end of the day, the Liberal Party, the Sask Party, the Conservative Party, the Rhino Party, they can spend their money on whatever they want. It may or may not be a good idea, but it's their money.
Okay, question though about like a taxpayer angle here. So they're getting chopped up by the party. Let's say maybe this is happening. I don't know. Maybe it's happening in every province. I have no idea.
Apparently, it's only happening in Saskatchewan and British Columbia. Okay. And the controversy here is also kind of week 2 of a controversy about. There's no cap on union or corporate donations in BC. There's no cap on how much money you can raise or how much money you can give. And the Liberals have been very, very successful. So they had a $2 million debt after the last election. They've paid that off. My understanding is they have $4 or $5 million in the bank, plus what the local ridings have. They're fully funded for this campaign. They might be fully funded already or getting close for the 2021 campaign. So this is kind of the undercurrent. In question period, the NDP started throwing around the C word, which is commission. Is this a commission on donations? Mm. But you're talking about a party that's bringing in $3 or $4 million a year, $50,000. That's a bit of a tough line to draw.
Okay, but so what I'm wondering is, so you're looking at the Premier's salary. You're looking at MLA compensation, let's say, and you look at the premier's salary, the minister's salary, and you take that number, and it's usually quite a large number as it is. So then do you take into account, and then on top of that, they're receiving this. So does that factor into the discussion about the premier compensation at all, saying, well, maybe taxpayers, since you're getting kickbacks from the party, maybe taxpayers should be compensating you at a lower level because this puts you, way into the 1% or something like that.
Well, do me a favor. Don't bring up MLA compensation here because it's a secret that they haven't had a raise since 2009 or 2008. Mm-hmm. So they statutorily, they are supposed to get a cost of living increase every year. They've voted every single year, the Liberals, to forego that. So the only change in their compensation was when the budget was in deficit in 08, 09, 10, maybe even 11. I'm not sure when into 11. They had cabinet ministers had a 10% holdback on their salary. Now that they're back in balance, they get paid that full rate. But that's the only difference in their compensation. It's $101,000 a year for an MLA. It's about $150-ish for a cabinet minister, and it's close to $200 for the premier. But they haven't had a raise, and I'm in no mood to. After 7 years, if they came forward for one, it's a tough argument to make against it. So I'd rather them just forget about it. Well,
what about in Saskatchewan, Todd? I mean, do you think that should play into the conversation at all? Like, is that a relevant factor, or is it just totally irrelevant because it's party money?
I think you'd have to be careful with that because you look at the precedents across the board. So, for example, in Saskatchewan, there have always been farmers in government. On both sides, right? Right now, there are active farmers in the Sask Party government, but in the previous NDP government, there were active farmers there. Should their farm income play off against what they're taking from salary in terms of their government work? I don't know. I think it's hard enough to recruit good people, in government that I'd hate to make it harder in any way. So, to me, unless I saw a real problem, on this stuff, I'd probably wouldn't get into it too far. But I would say, though, that if I were premier, I'd think really carefully about, do I really need that $50,000? Yeah. Like a lot of these folks are going to do very well after they conclude their career. Their kids aren't going hungry right now. Certainly, they could make more money if they went to the private sector, likely. But what they're doing is a pretty unique opportunity as well. So I don't feel sorry for them in terms of giving up some of that money. But there's so many things that you pay a price for in politics that you didn't have a choice about. You just get hit, and it is what it is. Trying to not aim at your own foot and pull the trigger, that's a really important part of politics. And for $50,000, I'd probably leave that round in the chamber.
Yeah, good point. Well, we should probably shift gears here and talk about, especially Manitoba. Todd, you were on a few weeks ago. We talked a little bit about Saskatchewan, but Manitoba, the Greg Selinger era is over. We welcome the member for Costa Rica, Mr. Brian Pallister, as the new premier of Manitoba. Why don't you run us through the big sea change there? I mean, the NDP were in power for many, many years in Manitoba until last week.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, this was 16, 17 years in power for the NDP there. But I mean, it was going off the rails hard for a while. They started running deficits under Gary Dewar, the previous premier. They had balanced budgets. Generally, they had done reasonably well on a number of those things. But in 2009, they started running deficits, promised that they were going to be small, promised they were going to be temporary. Have you guys ever heard that story before? Yeah. And of course, they kept going and they got bigger. And then they got into a spiral of credit rating downgrades as well. Culminating in 2013, they broke the promise. The premier had said in the election, he had been accused that he was going to raise the PST, and he said it was nonsense. It's crazy talk. Of course I won't raise the PST. And they had a law in the book that you would have to have a referendum before a major tax increase. Instead, he just repealed that legislation and jacked the PST by 1%, which cost Manitobans roughly $300 million a year. It's crazy. To the point where his own cabinet and caucus revolted. He had 5 cabinet ministers hold a press conference saying the premier had to go. I don't know if that's ever happened before. No. That's amazing. cabinets are well known for, the sort of the slogan, we all hang together, we hang separately, and they hang together pretty good. Sometimes you have leaks where disgruntled cabinet members are, whispering to the media the premier's a jerk or whatever. But to go out and 5 of them hold a press conference saying the guy's got to go, unprecedented. And I mean, I think that shows how bad things got. One of the interesting things about the results, so new Premier Brian Pallister won with about 54% of the vote, 140 out of 57 ridings. Like, this is a huge landslide. And don't tell any of my friends here in Saskatchewan, but Premier Wall didn't even win with that big a number the first time around. And like, he's well known as a political rock star, and he didn't get those kind of numbers on his first round. But the interesting thing is Premier Pallister's numbers personally aren't huge. He's not a hugely personable character, and so he doesn't have a ton of draw that way.
Really tall.
Oh, he's monstrous. Yeah, he's what 6'7", I think. Yeah, he's a tall guy. But he was personally polling behind the party. But what that, I think, really shows is just the level of distrust that had grown in the governing NDP. This wasn't, I don't think, a partisan thing. It wasn't a philosophical thing. I don't think people were making a major choice that way. I think it was really a trust thing. Do you know what you're doing? And are you going to follow through on what you say you're going to do? And I don't think people believed that Premier Selinger knew what he was doing, and I don't think they believed anything he said about anything. And so he's got to go. And so it's going to be very interesting for the new government. I think they've got a tough situation. They're inheriting a $773 million operational deficit. The net debt is over $21 billion. They've got a huge hole to dig out of, and their mandate is mostly based on throw the bums out versus a lot of trust in their plan. So they've got a long ways to go, but they're doing some good things right off the top. And, I'm hopeful they're going to make some major changes.
Interesting. I'm pretty sure at the top of this segment, I said Saskatchewan instead of Manitoba. I was thinking of Manitoba. So what I found interesting when I looked into this, because I'm interested in the parallel between Manitoba and Alberta here, because now we see that our finance minister here is sort of dangling the idea of a PST, saying, no, it's not on our agenda, it's not on our plan, but if you want it, Albertans, we want to hear from you. So I think he's kind of coaxing sort of tax-happy third-party organizations to launch their little pro-PST campaigns. And then they can say, oh, we've heard from Albertans. Maybe I'm speculating too far into the future, but the thing is that the NDP specifically said that they weren't going to bring in a sales tax. There's no way they're bringing in a sales tax. They want to preserve the Alberta advantage without bringing in a sales tax. And we similarly have here the piece of legislation, the Taxpayer Protection Act, where you can't bring in a sales tax, because we've got none here, without first going to referendum and letting Albertans vote on this. And what I found it interesting when I looked into the Manitoba issue was that the former premier there, he actually raised the PST before the bill was even passed to take away Manitobans' right to vote on this issue. Like, I mean, that is just flies in the face of democracy, right? I mean, you don't even take the time to pass that bill before you take away the right to vote on that issue and actually raise the sales tax. That's crazy. And that was sort of the first nail in the coffin of his political futures, right?
Well, yeah, actually, I would say a little bit differently. I think he had injured himself badly in watering down the balanced budget legislation previous to that. So he had taken some big injuries there. But that's when he really stepped on the landmine. And that's an interesting part about people often discussing balanced budget legislation. Oh, it doesn't work. Future governments just amend it or get rid of it anyway. It doesn't really work. Well, the conservative government that predated this NDP government, they must be feeling pretty good about themselves and that they left that landmine there. They planted that where if any government ever got crazy enough to repeal that legislation and to ignore it, they would pay a huge price. And boy, did they ever. I mean, they jumped on it with both feet and they paid a huge price. I would say that legislation worked because it was repealed, not because people followed it. And so I think there's a huge amount of value in that kind of legislation. So I think that's important. But I think also it's an important point here to talk about having a good debate about it. And it's interesting to see the NDP being cautious about it. Look, they believe in raising the tax, I'm sure. They believe in increasing the spending. But you have to have that conversation with people. And if you look at for Premier Selinger, if he would have had that debate, he might have won it. He might have been able to portray the finances as so bad that taxpayers had to pay more. I think what he would have actually got, though, is people saying, no, we don't want the tax hike. Here's your mandate to go make some tough decisions and cut spending, which is, I think, Jordan, what happened with you guys in the TransLink debate. Really, what they've got there is a mandate to go back into TransLink and fix it. People, they want mass transit, but they want it to run smoothly. Premier Selinger gave up on that opportunity to get that strong mandate. And I think, if those advisors that came from Manitoba are now advising Premier Notley do their jobs, they're going to tell her, Premier, if you're going to raise it, talk to the people about it. Make sure they're convinced to do it, because if you just ram this through, be checking the want ads pretty soon, because you're going to need a new job.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's like an interesting point. It has good ramifications all across the country. I mean, many provinces have, BC does, balanced budget laws, for example. And the knock is always, well, government can just repeal them. Mm-hmm. But what we've seen now from Manitoba's experience is that there is a big political cost to repealing that kind of legislation without permission from the people ahead of time. So
it's a huge cost. I mean, the issue is building slowly over time, but sometimes that can be almost imperceptible. You're boiling the frog a little bit at a time and it doesn't jump out. But that was a tipping point where people could see, A, I'm going to be paying more, and B, I can't trust these guys. And once it gets to that point, it was interesting. The NDP was throwing out all kinds of crazy stuff by the end of the Manitoba campaign. Nobody cared. Anything they said, just nobody cared, because they didn't believe them. And boy, once you lose your credibility in politics, you don't have much left. And that's where this kind of legislation is extraordinarily meaningful and important.
How does the best analogies, like boiling the frog? Like, who thinks that?
It's the prairie-ness in them. Now, Todd, the NDP, kind of the natural governing party of Manitoba, one would say they're in power more often than they're not. I imagine they're regrouping. How does their rebuild unfold, do you think? And is this sometimes you get elected once, but it's really for 2 terms because of how far ahead you are. Barring any major disasters, do you see a quick rebuild here? Is there enough of a core in the NDP that can be rebuilt around?
Well, I think that's something that's really interesting when I'm looking at both provinces here. The NDP obviously used to be extremely powerful in Saskatchewan. That's where it started. Obviously, it's had a lot of power in Manitoba for a long time. And I'm not sure people have changed dramatically in terms of philosophy. I think that would be something, possibly an overreading of this. But one thing that people care about is competence. They want to see somebody who can read the balance sheet, knows you can't spend too much more money than you bring in, certainly not consistently. And they want somebody that when they say they're going to do something, there's at least some reason to believe that they're going to actually follow through on that. I think the NDP in both provinces here is interesting, even though one was in government, one was in opposition here. As I watched both of them, they just didn't have much of a narrative to huge swaths of the population. So agriculture is such a good example. When they're trying to talk to farmers and their only message is stuff about, organics and stuff like this, for a guy who's pulling a 100-foot air seeder, whose combine can literally hold his fuel tank holds 1,000 gallons of diesel, talking about selling an $8, organic potato just doesn't really make a lot of sense. Which isn't, this is an issue that they've got to grapple with, is how are we going to have a coherent narrative to talk to people about how they're going to take care of their money properly, how they're going to protect services that are under threat when you have more and more in debt and more interest costs. I think they're going to get there. Even a long wandering time in the wilderness eventually will bring you to some of those policies, and I think they will get there. But particularly in Manitoba, I think structurally they've got big problems. It's a heavily divided party between some of the folks that still backed Premier Selinger through it all, versus some of the so-called traitors or whatever, rebels or whatever you want to call it. And then even money-wise, their fundraising is way down. And Premier Pallister is doing the right thing and getting rid of the vote tax, where the NDP used to take whatever it was, $300,000 from voters or from taxpayers every year. That's going to be gone.
Mm-hmm.
And
I
so,
did not know that.
Yeah, it's outstanding. Actually, and Premier Pallister deserves a ton of credit. Even when they were eligible to take that money and other parties were taking it, they refused to take it.
Wow.
Which was a very principled stand. Now they're getting rid of it. That's the right thing to do. Ultimately, I think it'll be good for the NDP because it'll force them to go actually talk to people and convince them to give them money rather than just taking it from them ultimately by force through taxation. When you do that, you have to develop a little bit better customer service. You have to listen to the customer a little bit more as opposed to telling them what's good for them. In this case, the customer is a voter and they need to earn their trust back. So I think it's going to be a long process for them. But certainly the Pallister government, they can't get too comfortable because they've inherited a tough situation.
Yeah. Trailed off there at the end, Todd, but I'm not sure as well for the Manitoba NDP that rebuilding around guys like Wab Kinew is really the flavor of the farmer out there on the field working hard in Manitoba.
I wonder about that vote tax issue, though. That's very interesting because I wonder if it's going to happen here. The NDP here banned corporate and union donations, and then we've got a divided right. So the vote tax, meaning, anybody who casts a vote, $2 or whatever it would be goes to that political party, could be an interesting way to, I think, keep the right divided if they were thinking politically. So I'm sort of keeping a close eye on that, especially since, the federal level, it was after they banned corporate and union donations that they brought this in. So, yeah, it's interesting that it's being scrapped in Manitoba.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, let me go to the waste of the week. It's our usual feature to cap the show. So, Paige, it cost BC Hydro $17.5 million last year to ask 8 independent power producers of biomass energy to turn off production because their power was not needed. So think about that for a second. At a time when our electricity rates are going up, presumably because power costs more to produce, the government monopoly is now paying companies not to produce power. That's our waste of the week here in BC. Sorry, part of the resignation in my voice.
That's ridiculous. So do these kinds of things have any political implications? Like, are taxpayers, caring about this or what?
Well, BC Hydro is under a lot of scrutiny because they're building a mega dam in eastern BC called Site C. Part of the deal there is perhaps selling power to Alberta in return for us looking the other way and allowing a pipeline to come through. But the way BC Hydro is being run, I think it's becoming more and more of an issue. The question is, will it be a ballot issue in 2017? Will it actually move votes?
Interesting. Well, I have a little update as well. City of Calgary has now completed another piece of art, $450,000. So, if you were worried about, people who lost their jobs, have no money here in Calgary, rest assured there will be art, taxpayer funded, almost $500,000 art. So
it's the creative economy, Paige. Come on.
Yet another one. They just keep coming.
Todd, anything else on the Manitoba side, or you want to pop in a word about Saskatchewan, where you're at with it?
Well, one quick thing on Manitoba is we calculated some of the pensions for MLAs that were outgoing, and several of them topped well over $1 million in estimated liability all the way out. That's not the biggest part of the problem. The biggest part of the problem, of course, is how much they put in. And we don't even really know because they put in about 7%. They've got a defined benefit program, or pension. So no matter how much they put in, they get their money out. They're entitled to their entitlements. That's wrong. It's so wrong. It needs to be reformed to be a defined contribution pension where they get to take out what they put in, just like all the rest of us do when we look at our RSPs and all that kind of stuff. And even that, it's really not the biggest issue, to be totally honest with you. It really is important in the sense that MLAs, decision makers in the legislature, are going to have to address this issue for public sector pensions someday. It has to happen. We've got liabilities running into the billions on many of these pension plans. It needs to get fixed. But as long as those guys are at the trough, it's not going to get fixed. So they need to fix it now. So we're just running an op-ed in the Winnipeg Sun today, asking the Pallister government to move on that right quick. It's never going to get easier than today. So let's get on it right away.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And in BC, it's $4 taxpayers put in for every dollar that a politician puts in. Look, none of us are saying what we. I think most taxpayers we'd be okay with matching dollar for dollar, and into an RSP or whatever. But this has gone too far.
Well, especially when the liability is not covered, when we don't know what's going to happen 20 years from now. One of two things happens if there's a liability. Either we're not able to keep the promises to people who are counting on that money to retire, and the money's not there, or taxpayers 20 years from now, many of whom didn't get a chance to vote on this, take it on the chin and have to pay up, which is basically what's been happening now for years. That can't go on forever. We got to change that. So it's a small change, frankly, to do that for MLAs in Manitoba. It's one they could just do. They don't really need new legislation or whatever. They could just do it. So just go and do it, boys. It's got to get done.
True enough. All right. Well, that's it for this episode of Tax Talk from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Be sure to follow Paige on Twitter at Paige MacPherson. Follow me at Jordan Bateman. Follow Todd. He's everywhere at Cut the PST, at Todd A. MacKay. Follow him on Facebook and see pictures of his kids playing softball or baseball. It's great. If you're watching this on Blab, be sure to subscribe to our feed and give us props. And if you're listening to this later on iTunes, please subscribe and give us a good rating. I believe we are back in we're coming in close to the top 10 in the government and organizations iTunes section. So clearly there's not enough of those around to keep us out. So we gotta keep driving in there. You can check our website.
Luke too, who just said great show. Thank you. So thank you for tuning in.
Thank you. Yeah, check our website at taxpayer.com and be sure to join us again next week, Friday, May the 6th, 9 a.m. Pacific, noon Eastern. Paige is away on assignment, but I'm going to try to rope in some sort of comic book geek so that we can geek out and talk about the libertarian versus government regulation undertones of Captain America Civil War. So something a little bit different next week. Hopefully, if I can find the right co-host. Otherwise, I'll just come on and blather on for 25 minutes about Captain America and really embarrass myself and my family and my organization, possibly my province as well. But I'll behave. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. See you next week.
Thanks.
See you later.